Okay, today I'm going to be talking about CSS Grid. How many of you have already done something with CSS Grid or played around with it? Anybody? Oh, okay. Great. Well, I will do my best. This presentation is all on Google Drive, so if you want to take more time to look at slides or anything, the link is in the bottom right-hand corner right there. So you can actually follow along and look at the code examples and click through to some of the links or whatever if you'd like to. I think I have that in other places in the presentation if I need to. Okay, I'm going to go ahead. So my name is Stephen Bell. I worked for 10 years in higher ed marketing. My background is graphic designer to web developer to digital marketer to business owner. Those jobs weren't really separate jobs. It's just kind of the weird winding path that I've taken. So I really love doing web development. I love doing front-end development, and I'm really excited about CSS Grid. Our company is Steed Interactive. When we started, we were doing branding, design, and web development. And now we're expanding into doing content creation, blogging, social media management, online ad management, conversion rate optimization, and e-commerce stuff. So if anyone is interested in any of that stuff, I'd love to talk to you about that too. Okay, I'm going to start with a little bit of history of web layout stuff. So what you're looking at right here is the very first page on the World Wide Web by Tim Berners-Lee. It doesn't really have any layout because I didn't need it. It was all about, here is a document that I made, and look at this, I can click on a place in the document and it takes me to another document. It was just this groundbreaking idea, but nobody cared how things were laid out then. History of web layout, like I just said, the hyperlinked documents, and then tables was all about putting the entire layout into your HTML document. There was no separate CSS at first. Floating images was designed to wrap text around your images in your page. It was not really designed to do layout work, but that's what we've ended up doing with it, is that we take entire columns and we float this one to the left and this one to the left, and then we end up with this 2 or 3 column layout. CSS layout libraries that started like 960 was a big one before responsive design. Now a lot of people use Bootstrap, or I liked Foundation. And then Flexbox was a few years ago, that's another option people used. I promise this is the only animated GIF you will see in the whole presentation. I just thought that was pretty cool. Okay, so ideally you have a separation of concerns in your code. HTML is all about the text and information that goes into your site. It's the actual content that Google is indexing and that is read to screen readers. CSS is all about the appearance and how things look. And JavaScript is all about interacting with the visitor. When they click on something, it pops open a window, or it moves things around, or interacting with other databases, other servers in real time. If you are able to separate these things out, you can change the design. You can change the design without changing the HTML. I can make my page look like beautiful. I can change the colors, the fonts, all that kind of stuff, the layout, because it's all in the CSS, not the HTML. Okay. How many of you have heard the word semantic when you're talking about HTML? Okay. So the goal with HTML is that you write it with, here's an H1, here's a paragraph, here's an H2, here's a paragraph, here's a nav element, so that's probably the navigation. Everything in your HTML should be about the meaning of what's in your HTML and not how it's displayed. This little thing on the right side is HTML5 outliner. I just ran that on a random website. So you can see that Google understands the structure of your website and what you're trying to get at. And if you can, avoid putting style information into the HTML. CSS Frameworks. This is the one that I've liked, that I've used before, Foundation, where you are able to really quickly in your HTML say this element should take up a third of the screen. When you're at this size, this element should take up half the screen. And you kind of put your stuff in there like that. It's a little bit clunky, but it's way faster than trying to manually kind of arrange things on the page one at a time. So this is an example of what some foundation code looks like. So you're saying here's a row, here's a column within that row. When the screen is medium sized, it takes up 8 out of 12 columns. Like it all works, but it's not real easy to understand if you haven't done this before. And it's not separating the style information from the semantic information. This is putting style stuff into the page. That's why it's not great. CSS Grid lets you stop using a lot of these extra classes. It means that you don't need to nest elements inside of each other as much. You don't need a whole bunch of extra divs like this is a row, this is a row, this is 2 elements inside a column. It gets rid of a lot of that stuff in favor of you just drop all the HTML into the page and then you can figure it out afterward. And CSS Grid also lets you do a lot of weird layout stuff that just wasn't possible before. So everything that's come before this, trying to do table layouts, trying to do float-based layouts, they're kind of hacks. That stuff wasn't ever really intended for page layout. Tables are intended for data that's in rows and columns. Floats were originally intended for images to float left and right. So this is the first time that they've really had this all-inclusive. This is intended for web layout system. Okay, CSS Grid is written from the outside in. So if you've used something like Flexbox before, or if you've used your float-based layouts, you know that you're telling this box right here that it's taking up a third of the screen, and this box is taking up a third of the screen, and this box is taking up a third of the screen. It's always starting on the inside and working its way out. CSS Grid is all about setting up a layout for the entire page and then telling things where to go within that layout. So it's a more natural system. The two graphics on here, CSS Grid can be just like the grids you've used before, where everything is nice and even. The FR unit down here, let me do this. FR means a fraction of the width. So this is a fraction, this is a fraction, this is a fraction. These are all equal 4 columns. And then this is saying make the rows equal too. So these will always be the same height as each other going this way. And then this one is a grid that is way weirder than that. So this column is always going to be 500 pixels wide. So when you rearrange the screen, these other 2 columns will fill in whatever space is left. That's what the fraction means to the FR unit. So this column will always be twice as big as this one, but they'll just resize along with the screen. Auto means that whatever content is in here, the height of these rows is just going to change to fit that content. Okay, if you've used Flexbox before, you may have wondered, like, why do we need another system for laying things out? Flexbox is for laying out items in a single dimension. So Flexbox is good for, here's this thing, this thing, this thing, this thing, and then there's not enough space and it wraps down to the next row. It kind of flows like text flows. And you can do a lot of cool stuff with Flexbox, but Grid is designed for laying things out 2-dimensionally. You can put things wherever you want to into the layout. Okay, I like Codepen. Have you guys used Codepen before? It's an online HTML, JavaScript, and CSS editor that lets you see your changes online as you make them, and it's really good for sharing things back and forth. So the examples I'm going to show you, I've actually created in Codepen. So if you visit the slideshow, and this link will be up here later, you can click on those links and get to my examples if you're curious. Okay, here is my first use case, is just repeating elements on a page. So if you're doing a portfolio, you don't need to do anything fancy with your HTML. That's kind of the whole point, is you just have a portfolio class, and then we have a link with an image in it, and a link with an image in it, and it just keeps going on and on like that. So here's how you would set up the CSS for that. So portfolio, display grid, and then this is the important one, grid template columns. This is one fraction, one fraction, one fraction. So this is make 3 equal columns, and then the space between these grid elements is going to be 16 pixels. You don't really need to do anything fancy with the links in here. They're just going to kind of flow between these things. And then I'm putting a width of 100% of those pictures just because I want them to fill each of those spaces. Here's another little trick for CSS Grid. Instead of doing 1FR, 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 which is kind of obnoxious, you can type repeat in here. So I can say repeat 3, repeat 6, repeat whatever, and it's really easy just to change that out without repeating yourself. Okay. So another thing that's really cool about this grid system is that you're not stuck just specifying the number of columns in the grid or the number of rows. You can do this autofill thing where it'll try to cram in as many different columns as it can into the page. Like whenever there's enough space for another 320 pixel wide column, it'll add another column. It's let me show you what that looks like real quick. Okay, sorry, this is not. I made it full screen and I shouldn't have. So there's no media queries in this, there's no breakpoints. It's just fitting more stuff into the page whenever it can.
No media queries.
No media queries.
That's part of this whole presentation.
Okay, next one. This is the important part of this whole presentation. This is the reason that I really like CSS Grid, is that what I'm about to show you is way easier than anything you've probably ever done before with layout. This is kind of a classic example of, here's a whole page layout. Here's the header, here's kind of a main bunch of content, here's a news area, here's a sidebar, here's a footer, and those are all done using HTML5 elements. So if you wanted to do this with other systems, like you would be figuring out, okay, this is the full width, this one is 66%, this one is 30%, somehow I need to make this one drop down to this column. It's really just a hassle to deal with all that stuff. So this is how easy it is with CSS Grid. So I'm doing display grid like before. This is the trick I just used a second ago, 3 equally sized columns. And then this thing right here, grid template areas, for each of the items in here, I give it a name, and this can be whatever you want. This can be a number. It could be 1, 2, 3, 4. It could be, you just type whatever you want in here. And then this is a row, and you just type in what you want each of these things to be in each row. So header, header, header is put the header here, here, and here. Put the main element here and here, and aside over there. News, news, aside, footer, footer, footer. So I hope that's intuitive. The other nice thing about this is that when you do need to write media queries and breakpoints, yes. I have them at the end, but if there's something you want to know.
Why did you do 3, 1 FR on this one specifically?
Because I can. I could have written it 1 FR, 1 FR, 1 FR. If I wanted to make the middle column wider than the other two, I could type, it doesn't really matter. It's just a little bit of a shorthand.
Segmenting, I guess. Because since you have main newsletter you fit to the side, you
Well, I mean, this is kind of an imitation of a layout that you would do using a CSS framework or whatever. You're not stuck with this. I'm just telling it where to put the sidebar. Okay, so because we already have the grid areas named, if I want to do a 2-column or a narrower layout that only has 2 columns in one part, then I just change the template columns, and then I change the template areas like this. So this is basically the layout CSS for the whole site is just right here. There's nothing else going on. And then you don't need to redefine all that stuff when I go to a smaller size. So now it's just 2 columns, header, header, main, main, news, aside, footer, footer. And then if I wanted to do a mobile version, same thing, header, news, main, aside, footer. And I noted in here, I changed the order with these things too. So news used to be down here right above the footer, but because I can just tell these things where to go, I bumped it up to the top of the page. So you just shuffle everything around as much as you want to, tell it where it fits. Okay, I mentioned before that you can do some design stuff with this that would be a lot harder to do with other ways of doing this. So here's an example. I can say, here's my regular 3 columns, but I want this header to go right here. I want the main to go here. I want the footer to go here. So instead of using the named areas like I did before to fill this in, and I could have still done that with this example too, but this is just to show you how you can fit things in here. So the header element is going from column 2 to column 4, so from 2 to 4, and from row 1 to row 2, so row 1 to row 2. And one thing that's potentially confusing about this is that you're not naming the columns. This isn't column 1, this isn't column 2, this isn't column 3. You're naming, or it's numbering the kind of the dividing between the columns. Yeah, so same thing here. The main element, this one is going from 2 to 3, from 2 to 3, and then the row is going from 2 to 4. And then footer, you can imagine, I don't have space for it. Okay. One thing that's kind of helpful for this is that Firefox has a grid inspector tool. So if you open up a page that has grid enabled in Firefox, you can open up the web inspector. Has everyone used the web inspector before in Chrome or in some? So if you look at the element that has grid assigned to it, this little icon right down here that looks like a grid, if I click on this, it's actually putting like a visual representation of what the grid is into the page. So even before you've put any elements into your grid, you can just kind of set up, here's my 3-column whatever, it's going to have rows that are this height, and then you can go and preview it before you drop anything else in, so that's nice for debugging. Okay. Grid is a great big complex system, and there's lots of stuff I'm not going to cover, but you can combine these things together. So like the image gallery that I did before, you can do a whole bunch of images like a portfolio, and then you can add a positioned element into it. So I want to put a call to action box in the 3rd row down that's going to be, that's either going to cover the whole width or whatever. If you are positioning things based on the row numbers and the column numbers, you can overlap them, because I can just say this one starts here and goes here, this one starts here and goes here, and they kind of have these cool overlaps. And because you can make the columns any size that you want to, or the rows any size that you want to, you can just have like tiny little overlaps between things. You can leave blanks in your design, like I want this to be an empty area here that shows through to the background. I want, it's really flexible to be able to do this stuff. Make an auto-placed element wider or taller by making it span multiple columns or rows. So in the example I did earlier of the portfolio, maybe I have one image that's really wide, so I can make that one span 2 columns. Like it's I can't remember what it is now, grid column span 2, something like that, where you can just make it go across the whole thing. The order stuff makes it really nice because you can, take an element from anywhere in your list of portfolio, make it the first one, make it twice as high, make it twice as wide. It just lets you kind of shuffle things around. Okay, browser support for this stuff. Has anyone used CanIUse before? CanIUse.com? So CanIUse lets you see for any particular browser feature how many people are actually able to use that. This is the number for the United States. 86% has the full support of the latest versions of this stuff. I would also encourage you that if you're wondering if you can use CSS Grid on a specific website, you can import your data from Google Analytics into CanIUse. So I can see, like, for this specific website, how many people can use this right now. So this is what it looks like on CanIUse. So you can see, like, most of these people have the ability to do this. The ones that don't right now, like, this is people who are using older versions of iOS Safari. So if you think about it, most of these people are using phones. So it's not like you need to do a lot of complex layout on your phone. So the fallback of, okay, it's just all in one great big column is maybe fine. Same thing over here, Android browser. The big holdout here is Internet Explorer 11 down there in the left-hand corner. People are still stuck on that because they're using older versions of Windows, or they're so you need to kind of figure out a strategy for Internet Explorer. What if you don't want to do anything for compatibility? Like I said, if you don't do anything at all, then it's just going to kind of display grid is going to default to display block. So it's just going to kind of throw all this stuff real big into your layout. And maybe for some sites, that's okay. If you just want people to be able to read the content on the site and you're not really worried about grandma and grandpa who have a computer from 2008, whatever, then it's still going to get the job done. If you do want to enhance this in a better way, then you can define everything as display flex, because that has a little bit better support. So everything that in my grid that would be laid out in a grid, I can put it into a flex layout and then kind of say, this thing should only ever be half the width of the screen, or I want to limit this so that it's not ever a huge wide area of text. You can do that kind of stuff. How many of you have seen this @supports stuff before? This is called feature queries, and it's pretty widely supported, where if you type this into a browser, it's going to ignore this stuff in here unless this is true, unless this is supported. So if you want to know if somebody can, or if you want to add more styles to your page that are specific to CSS Grid, then you can do that. One thing that's kind of annoying about this is that you should be able to do supports not, like Internet Explorer 11 does not support display grid. And that would be awesome, because then you wouldn't need to override all the styles. The problem with that is Internet Explorer 11 does not supports. So that's why you have to write everything the regular way and then write everything else kind of over top of that. Quick tip if you are doing this is if you want to see the non-grid styles, you can either comment out this entire thing over and over again, or else you can just type something that's nonsense into this area right here, and then there's nothing actually called grid X. I just typed an X after it, so that's going to turn off all of these styles, and then it's going to fall back to these ones here. Here is an example of a project that I actually worked on with using a CSS framework. And this is this image should take up 2/3 of the screen, and then it should have two buttons next to it that are the same height as each other, that there's always enough room for the text in the buttons. They're not a set height. So I don't know how many people have dealt with stuff like this, but this is a royal hassle to try to set this stuff up using the regular CSS techniques. I had to do a bunch of JavaScript-based stuff using Foundation so that it would automatically detect the height of these elements and then make them equal to each other, and then this kind of had to figure that out. And then on mobile sizes, these buttons get tucked underneath. So I wish I had had something like Grid when I was doing these things, because this is literally like, this is span 2 columns, span 2 rows. The grid has equal sized rows, and you're done. And then with the media query, it's a 2-column wide layout that this has a set height and this has a set height, and those are the same width as each other. Like it solves a lot of problems that you might not have realized that you had until you really start breaking it down. Okay, further reading. If you're interested in CSS Grid, Jen Simmons is really good, and Rachel Andrew is really good. They're both on Twitter, but they also have websites where this is all of her layout experiments. This is all her kind of tutorials. And then if you guys are on CSS Tricks, this is a huge page that lists out everything that you would set on the parent element and everything you would set on the child element, and has little diagrams. Like, this is one of those pages that I have visited hundreds of times probably. Like, oh, how do I name a grid area again? Then you go to this page. It's such a handy reference. And then Grid Garden is a game that you can play in your browser where they have, you have this layout and there's some plants over here, and how do I make the water go over top of these plants and not these plants? It's just this kind of learn CSS Grid game. Okay, anybody have any questions?
So if you wanted to have parts of your layout full width and part of them in a defined width area, can you do that all inside the same grid, or do you need to define different ones?
Yeah, here, let me.
So you had like a banner that would, or like a hero that was full width, but then the rest of your stuff was
Oh, I see what you're saying. Yeah, I mean, you can set a grid for the entire page, but you can just set it element by element too. So, and the CSS you already know still works. So like this one right here that I have as an example, I've made a max width on the containing element, and I have margin 0 auto. So it's like auto filling in the space on the side, and then I'm doing the grid inside of that. I've seen people do weird layouts that are like, there are columns on the sides that are 1 FR, and then there's a set width on the columns inside. So it's kind of doing this for you just with grid, where it's auto filling in the space on the sides of the pages. But yeah, you could make a header image, a hero image up here that's full width, and then just add your other containing element down there that's, or, you know, for that matter, you could do the stuff I just said with the auto placed columns on the sides, and then set it up so that your hero element just spans the entire width and everything else is in these columns over here. I mentioned earlier, like this is repeating, you know, whatever number of columns can fit in here layout. And then this kind of call to action thing right here is positioned as start in the second column, start on the left side, and one image away from the right side. Like you can do, it's really nice just to be able to put all this stuff together, and it's just so quick. Yeah.
So if you're doing like a more complex layout, if you go back to the example, you have like a header, a side, and the grid, you have like you have your main.
Are you talking about this, or do you want to see the slide?
The slide, yeah. Where you have like your actual grid template areas there. Can you target those based off of like if it was say based off? Oh, I guess never mind. It's a news class, so I guess it's using the classes as well as the element.
This is not using the classes. This is a separate naming system that's just for grid. So again, like,
You guys have grid area there. Never mind. Okay. Answer my question.
no, it's fine. Yeah.
You mentioned that you could size things like fractionally, or you could assign them like 300 pixels instead of now. If you wanted to base like, I want this row to be the same height as this row, and this row is this height as contents. Could you do that pretty easily?
Yeah. Yeah. So this one right here, this column, or sorry, this row is equal in height to this row, and this row is twice the height of those ones. So
if you added content to the top row, would it increase the height of the bottom row?
yeah.
Okay.
So it doesn't do that by default. By default, everything kind of just fits what it can fit. This is the, hold on a second. This is the one that's doing that. Grid auto rows 1FR. So that means every row is equal in height to every other row. And then this is only double height because I told that to go from 2 to 4. So it's spanning 2 rows. That's why it's twice as tall.
If you wanted to do that grid auto thing on just certain rows, could you do that?
Yeah, yeah. So auto rows is like just fill everything in auto. But if I wanted to instead, I could do grid template rows, and then I'm not sure if this will work or not actually. Like you can set up so that each of the rows on the page is doing its own thing. So like, for example, if I wanted to make an element at the top of the page that's the whole height of the, So the top element's always going to be the height of the entire viewport because I put in a 100 VH in there, viewport height, and then the rest of them fill in with whatever. So you can do like, this is an intro image that fills up the entire screen, and then you put whatever you want underneath that, or there's lots of ways of kind of mixing and matching this stuff. Any other questions?
What if you want to support quite older browsers?
I think you can do a lot with Flexbox, or you're saying before Flexbox even. So, maybe there's still a space for, I need to support Internet Explorer 9. Maybe you should still use Foundation or something like that instead. Or maybe for those small number of people, it's good enough to give them a layout that's not very fancy.
That would be, we can't use supports or we can't do any of that stuff.
Right. Okay. Let me give you one more thing that might help you. If I can find the right one. Sorry. Okay. So that at supports in CSS has a JavaScript equivalent, where in JavaScript you can say, hey, does this support this? So what I've done here is first of all, check to see if this new CSS thing exists or not in this browser, and then check to see if it supports the specific thing that I want. And then from there, I'm adding a class to the body of the page. So this is, if anyone's used something like Modernizer before, that's kind of what that does, is it detects something and then it puts classes into your HTML that says, hey, this supports it or it doesn't support it. So this is more of a hassle to deal with, but it's actually like, you really could write some classes where IE9 would know that it doesn't support this thing. And then you just write them in as no CSS Grid, whatever, or kind of set up two different versions of the CSS. Anybody else? It's really up to you if you think you should do this now or not. It's actually really amazing that support for this is as good as it is, because last February there wasn't a browser in the world that did this out of the box, and now we're up to 86%. So really, Internet Explorer is the only thing holding you back. So if you're doing something like iOS apps that just look through into a page, that kind of stuff, then go ahead and use it. Like if you're not writing desktop versions of things, if you're doing mobile-only stuff, for sure use Grid. If you're doing a page where you don't really care very much about the people using Internet Explorer 11, they're not your target, they're not, then they can still see the content on your site. It just isn't going to be as pretty for them, which is okay, I think.
All right.